more than 460,000, 460 million negligence claims. Sorry, am I actually on the presentation? I'm not, am I? Am I? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So basically, there are 3 medical devices directives. So the first one is active implantable medical devices directive, and this covers products which are actually implanted into the body and that actually have a power source. So here you're talking about things like pacemakers, implantable defibrillators, cochlear implants, that sort of thing. And cochlear implants, that sort of thing. So that's the first directive. The second directive is the Medical Device Directive, and this covers most other devices. So here you're talking things like walking sticks, orthopedic implants, breast implants, condoms, hearing aids, all the ITU equipment, scanners, X-ray equipment, breast implants, for example, contact lenses, dental filling materials, all that sort of thing. So that directive covers most of the other medical devices. And then you've got the In Vitro Diagnostics Directive, which basically covers products where you're actually taking samples from the body. So you're actually taking blood or saliva or issues like that, and then you're actually carrying out a diagnostic test on those products. So things like a pregnancy test kit that you buy over the counter at a chemist shop, that would be an in vitro diagnostic test, and things like reagents which are used for testing for HIV or blood grouping, things like that. So those are the three directives. I just want to really give a summary of what's actually in them. So basically, they came about as a result of European legislation. The problem with medicines came about, and the medicines legislation came about because of the result of thalidomide back in the 1960s. So in the mid-1960s for medicines, the regulations came out from Europe due to that. But for medical devices, it was actually the industry that wanted it. Basically, the UK had its own set of requirements, the Germans had their own set of requirements, French, etc., had all their own sets of requirements. And basically, all those different individual member states were applying their own requirements to medical devices. And the manufacturers got fed up with it. So UK manufacturers being inspected by the French, the German, the UK, and everybody like that. But I have to admit, at the time, it was my dream job. I used to travel around the world inspecting all these medical device plants. So it was like all the latex products in the Far East, things like condoms, and urinary catheters and that sort of thing. In Germany, it was all the metal products, things like orthopedic implants, dental materials. And in the USA, it was all these sort of innovative types of products, things like pacemakers and that sort of thing. So basically, instead of everybody flying all the way around the world looking at all these things, it basically became a European requirement. And basically, now in Europe, there's only one set of requirements, so you don't get all the individual countries. So basically, it was an industry-led push for actually having legislation, not from a safety perspective. So basically, it specifies essential requirements. These are all the requirements that a product has to meet. So probably a pacemaker is the perfect example of what practically all the requirements for a pacemaker have to be met. So you've got software considerations, you've got sterilite, it's got to be clean, so it's got to be a sterile product before it's placed into the body. The materials that a pacemaker is made from has got to be biocompatible with the body tissues. You've got electrical safety, you've got electromagnetic compatibility, so that when you walk through an X-ray machine at an airport, it's not going to trigger off the pacemaker or an implantable defibrillator to shock. You've got clinical issues as well. So basically, it covers all the different requirements that a product should meet, and obviously you choose the relevant ones for your particular products. So basically, as Ewan said, there's also quality system requirements that are introduced for manufacturers. So in terms of how the products are designed, the systems that are in place, they must have systems in place to design, manufacture and test products. And also it specifies requirements for assessment of clinical investigation protocols. So if a medical device is used for the first time in humans, normally you'd expect it to be tested on human beings. And with regard to software, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later, there are certain software apps that would probably need to actually go through a clinical investigation before they could actually be placed on the market and be able to meet the requirements. So basically, if there's a serious adverse event, so say if a typical example is if you've got a heart valve and that fails, basically the person is going to drop dead pretty quickly. So basically there's requirements in the directives to make sure that any adverse incidents that occur with the devices are sent through to the relevant country where the incident occurred. So if necessary, they can take action to take products off the market that aren't safe. Now, I said there were over 500,000 medical devices on the market. What's contained in the medical devices directive is a classification system. Basically, there's 10,000, if you consider there's 10,000 medicines on the market in the UK, and MHRA have got 1,000 people looking at those medicines, looking at carrying out inspections of the manufacturing facilities, looking at the technical documentation. So if you're considering you've got 500,000 medical devices, that's 50 times as many devices on the market as there are medicines. So in theory, you need 50 times as many staff. So MHRA, to make sure that if we applied the same requirements for medical devices, we need 50,000 staff at the medical devices at the MHRA. So you can imagine that there's no way that the government are going to employ 50,000 people just to regulate medical devices. So basically there's a classification system. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So basically, for medical devices, there are these bodies called notified bodies who actually carry out assessments of the medical devices. Whereas for medicines, it's the government authorities that do it. For medical devices, it's commercial organisations who are designated by ourselves and other countries to actually carry out that task. And some of you may be familiar with some of them. British Standards Institute, for example, is one. Lloyd's is another one, for example. SGS. So they're third-party commercial organisations that actually undertake this task. And also introduced a system of registering devices, so low-risk devices and in vitro diagnostic products are registered under the requirements as well. So I'll just give a quick overview of what the manufacturer's responsibilities are. For their products, they have to review and comply with the essential requirements for their products. They put in the quality systems. If applicable, they need to apply to this third-party body to assess and test the products. The key document that they have to make is the Declaration of Conformity, which actually, that's the declaration that they make to say that their product meets all the requirements and their product is safe and performs as intended. If applicable, they register with the relevant authority in whichever country they're in, and they apply the CE marking, and this is the marking that's applied to a medical device. So all medical devices should come with a CE marking. I'll explain that to you in a little bit more detail later. And they must operate a post-market surveillance and vigilance system for gathering post-market data to demonstrate the product's performing as it should do, and also to report any adverse events. So the notified body, what do they actually do? Well, they'll assess the manufacturer and the products, and they will issue what's known, it's normally called an annex approval or a certification. And for high risk in vitro diagnostic products, they actually test every batch or review every batch. So things like HIV, blood grouping, hepatitis, they'll actually review the batch history for each high risk product before that product can be placed on the market. Once they've been given the approval or certification, the notified body will carry out ongoing surveillance. Normally it's an assessment of the manufacturing facility about once a year, and they approve changes. So if a manufacturer wants to add new product ranges to their range, and they'll look at that. And we work very closely, the MHRA and notified bodies work closely together to sort of regulate the marketplace of medical devices. So this is us, MHRA. We're the competent authority in the UK for the medical device requirements. So these are the activities that we actually undertake. We've got about 100 staff responsible for medical devices. Most of them are looking at the adverse event reporting. So the majority of people within the agency are looking at the adverse event reporting. So notified bodies, what we do there is we designate them, we make sure they've got the right competence to carry out the assessments, and we monitor how they're performing. So we'll go along with them to when they're carrying out an assessment of a manufacturer on site. We'll also visit their head offices. Pre-market, we register the products. If it's a clinical investigation, the manufacturer wants to carry out a clinical investigation in the UK, they have to submit all their preclinical test data to ourselves. So obviously we want to be absolutely 100% sure that device is going to be as safe as possible before it actually goes into a human being, if it's an implant, for example. We also review what's known as TSC summary reports. Some of you will remember the CJD and bovine material, Some medical devices contain animal material derived from cows, for example, and there are extra requirements in there to make sure that the sourcing of the materials that are used in medical devices of that nature are safe. Post-market, as I said, the majority of staff within the agency who are working on medical devices work in the vigilance area, and there's constant, we get about 15,000 reports a year of adverse events. So obviously that's quite clear. We need to pick up signals of devices that aren't performing and take action to remove those products from the market which are unsafe. And throughout the whole process, we have an enforcement role. And I will mention this with regard to software. There's been an absolute explosion of software on the market, and basically we just haven't got the resources to look at every single app or whatever that's on the market and to determine whether or not it meets the requirements or whether it's a medical device or not. So the only activity that we undertake with regard to enforcement for for apps is basically if we get some information, say from a competitor or a member of the public, to say this product isn't working or it's unsafe, then we would investigate it. But unless we actually hear about it, we haven't got the resources to do proactive investigations on apps, on those apps that are on the market. So we don't trawl websites or anything like that to see what apps are available. And we know that there's lots and lots of apps that are on the market out there which aren't CE marked and possibly don't meet the requirements. So just go into a little bit of detail about the risks. I won't go through the individual items, but you can actually, just by looking at the screen, you can see the types of products that fall into low, medium and high. And I'll just explain a little bit about what happens to that. So for the low risk devices, there's nobody looks at those products at all. Basically, it's pretty much down to the manufacturer to declare that their products meet the requirements. So, I mean, I can list a lot more like that, but basically, it's probably about 25% of products don't need any review by anybody at all. So for the low risk products, they just go onto the market with no review by anybody. It's down to the manufacturer. For medium risk products, what happens there is the notified bodies, these are the bodies that carry out the inspections of the manufacturing facilities and the technical information on the products. What they'll do is they'll carry out an assessment at the manufacturing facilities, and then they'll sample some of the products that are actually being manufactured there. So, for example, if a manufacturer is making, it's quite a large manufacturer who's making, say, 200 different types of products, the notified body won't look at every. Something not liking my presentation.
Because you're not registered.
So what happens here for medium risk products, the notified body will actually carry out an assessment of the manufacturing facilities, but they won't actually look at every single. So if a manufacturer's got 200 products, they'll only sample some of those products. So they're not looking at every single product. But for the high risk products, this is the equivalent pretty much as the control for medicines, whereby there'll be an inspection at the manufacturing facilities, but there'll also be a real detailed technical review of the products as well. So for the high-risk products, there's really close scrutiny on those because they're the highest risk products, and if they fail, in many cases, there's a likely resultant of death in the high-risk products. So if those products fail, then there's a high risk of death. So for those products, there is real tight controls. So I'll just put, this is sort of a summary of the system. So you've got the top left-hand side there, you've got a pacemaker. Basically, the manufacturer has to comply with the essential requirements and demonstrate the product is safe and performs. And then if you look in the middle there, you've got the notified body who will carry out an assessment of the quality system. They'll look at the design dossier and they'll look at the clinical data to demonstrate the product safe and performs as it's intended. And if that's the case, then the manufacturer on the left-hand side can place the CE marking on their product and place their product on the European market. Once the product's on the market, we go on to the bottom and middle there, where there's ongoing surveillance, because obviously you want to make sure that the product is, once it's on the market, is performing as it should and is safe. And basically we get feedback from manufacturers and users about the performance of medical devices on the market. So we're the competent authority, we assess the notified bodies, and we investigate any adverse events and take action against to ensure that the manufacturer makes any corrections or, if necessary, withdraws those products from the market or carries out a recall if we're concerned about the products. So that, in summary, is a brief summary of the overall regulatory system. So now I'm going to focus in on software. Is there any questions at this stage about the general requirements for medical device regulation?
Rob, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In terms of the manufacturer, who is the defined manufacturer, I don't know whether you're going to come on to it specifically in the context of software or not, but my recollection from reading, albeit the FDA guidelines last autumn, they seem to imply that if, for instance, you were a healthcare organisation and you were commissioning a developer to draw up the code, the developer themselves were only developing the code, they weren't the manufacturer. It was actually the party putting the clinical input into that, let's say Healthcare Act, that was actually the manufacturer. What's the MHRA's position?
Yeah, the manufacturer would be the body that's actually commissioning the code. So it wouldn't be the body that's actually coding up the software. It would be at the end of the day, it's the person who's placing the product on the market. So I don't know how it's going to be sold on a CD or on a download from a.
So I think we have to be very clear here, because I know we've got representation from councils, from universities, and from the NHS, and certainly from my discussions with some other NHS organisations, there is a perception that, well, actually the developer carries the cow in terms of the responsibility for some of this, but that's not the case.
No, it's not the case. It's the person whose name is actually going on the product at the end of the day, or the person that hands it over. So it's not, if somebody says, oh, I want you to come up with coding for this, and it's provided, then it's the person who takes responsibility, it's the person whose product it is at the end of the day. So
it's an important point.
Yeah, it's not the person developing the software.
Just kind of slightly in, so if you're, say, an NHS trust and you license the idea or the healthcare app to a company to actually bring it out, and they develop it and bring it out, but you will still going to have clinical input to help you develop it. Whose responsibility?
It would be the body that's placing it on the market. So it would be the company that's putting it on the market at the end of the day. Even though you've licensed it to somebody else to put their name on it, you would still have the liaison, but it wouldn't be your responsibility. For meeting the requirements, it wouldn't be your responsibility then if you've licensed it out and it's being marketed by that third party. So it's whoever's name appears on the tin, so to speak, at the end of the day. So it needs to be clear who's putting the product on the market, who's setting, like, you can buy Microsoft software from all sorts of places, but it's clearly on the box, it's a Microsoft product. I probably should have mentioned this slide. So basically when you put the CE mark on the product, basically the manufacturer is then saying that they're complying with all the requirements for safety and performance. So there is a definition in the actual regulations for software, and software is for medical devices, and software is along obviously many things which are included in there. So I just pulled out the word software from the actual definition. So basically software which is intended by the manufacturer to be used for human beings for the purpose of diagnosis. So if you're using it for a diagnostic purpose, it's not normally used for prevention, but it can be used for monitoring, it can be used in the treatment, probably not alleviation of disease either. And then the second bullet point relates to injuries or handicaps. Possibly. And then investigation, replacement or modification of the anatomy or the physiological process, where software doesn't really come into that. And finally, control of conception. So basically, these are the sort of terminology. If the app performs these sort of functions, MHRA would normally consider them to be a medical device. I mean, the list isn't exhaustive, but these are the sort of things that you need to think about. If it does any of these things, then it's possible that an app might be considered to be a medical device. Not in 100% of cases, but this is the sort of terminology. I'll go into a little bit more detail and give a few more examples. Sorry for the long words here, but I wanted to try and put it down in writing as to the sort of thinking that's coming out of the MHRA, and it is similar to the FDA guidance as well. So basically, if apps are used for decision support or decision-making software that apply some sort of automated reasoning, then they're normally considered to be medical devices. So, for example, if you're working out, say if a clinician types in some data on a patient and it works out a dose, and obviously the clinician is relying solely on the dose of the medication, and obviously if that's wrong, then may have serious consequences for the patient if they're given the wrong dose. So a dose calculator, and that's what's being relied upon by the clinician or the nurse to actually administer a dose of medication. That would be a medical device. Some sort of symptom tracking software, clinicians' guides. Those are the sorts of things which would be considered to be medical devices. Basically, software which provides personalised guidance based on the information it has about a specific individual, makes use of data entered by them. And again, that would normally be considered to be a medical device. So essentially, it's anything which is going to change the treatment of a patient. So if an output from an app is going to treat, and the information is going to be used, and that's going to change the normal treatment of a patient, that would probably be a medical device, because people are relying on the output from that app to carry out some kind of treatment or diagnosis. So there are also apps which act as accessories to medical, so you can actually use apps in conjunction with other medical devices, such as measurement of temperature, heart rates, blood pressure, blood sugars, that sort of thing. So what if they're being used in conjunction with them, and that's the reading, and they're doing some sort of interpretation, then they would normally be considered to be medical devices. As I said before, if the output from the app is going to affect the treatment of an individual, then that's likely to be a medical device. So software that provides general information but doesn't provide personalised advice that might be targeted to a particular user group is unlikely to be considered a medical device. So sometimes you can get some, I know for treatment of depression you can get some cognitive behaviour therapy, which sometimes you would actually normally speak to a psychologist or somebody like that, but sometimes you can get some software. If it's just standard software, which is the same all the way through, and it's not going to change dependent on what information is put into the system, and there's no reaction from the patient, and that wouldn't be considered to be a medical device. It's just a standard software package which is taking a patient through CBT. But obviously, if the patient was to put some information in and the software would be depending on the decisions made by the patient, the software then came up with a different route, then that would be a medical device. So it depends on how individualistic the software is treating the information that's being put in. And software that's used to book an appointment, request a prescription, or to have a virtual consultation is unlikely to be considered a medical device. It only has an administrative function. So again, going back to it, it's where the treatment is going to actually be affected by the output from the app. That's the key, really. Sometimes a software might provide some sort of general guidance for a clinical decision, but ultimately, this is where the grey area really comes in. If at the end of the day the clinician is maybe using it, but maybe using other sources of data to actually make a diagnosis or to treat a patient, then it becomes really grey in this particular area. And if it's the healthcare professional's final decision, then probably it isn't a medical device. But I think this is where the biggest grey area as to whether or not it's a medical app, whether an app falls within the medical device regulations comes about. So those are the sort of apps that we consider in the MHRA, and we are shortly going to be issuing some guidance in that area, as I said before. So hopefully that will be on our website within the next week or two, basically summarising what I've just said there with a little bit more detail. But obviously, if an app is a medical device, then it's essential that appropriate validation and verification activities are performed. For example, preclinical testing. For lots of apps, it's probably likely that you wouldn't need to do any clinical studies. You can there's other ways of actually getting the information from calculations or other ways, and you can actually bench test the app quite easily rather than actually carrying out any clinical evaluation or clinical investigation. Clinical evaluation is needed just to demonstrate that the product is safe and performs, and if necessary, a clinical investigation would need to be performed. Now, the only areas really where we think a clinical investigation would be needed is where you're actually using the device on the patient. And I have come across, you can take pictures or you can actually, it's mainly coming from the camera of a mobile phone or mobile tablet. There is information that you can place your finger over the camera and that will actually provide a diagnosis. So if you're actually going to be developing an app where there's direct patient contact with the mobile platform, then you probably need to carry out clinical investigation if that hasn't actually been performed. If it's a novel type of device and that device isn't on the market already, so you probably would need to carry out a clinical investigation to demonstrate the safety and performance, and also for that you need ethics committee as well approval. Because obviously, the patients are coming in for actually having a particular clinical investigation. So here we've got basically one of the key essential requirements is you've got to weigh up the safety of the product against the risks, and probably not so important with apps because, as I said, probably the main risk of an app going wrong is probably wrong dose calculations, and that's pretty serious. But basically you've got to weigh up the safety and risk of the device in terms of its use, and the device must achieve the performance intended by the manufacturer. So all software is considered to be active, so it's an active medical device, and implementing Rule 2.3 in the regulations. So software which drives a device or influences the use of a device automatically falls into the classification of that device. So if you're using an app to, say, drive blood glucose monitor or something like that, then that falls within the same classification. Rule 9 is an active therapeutic device is a generally Class 2A, however potentially hazardous then Class 2B. The reason most of the apps aren't actually therapeutic devices in their own right, that's where you're actually putting in energy to the patient, but they could actually drive some of these devices. So if apps drive any active therapeutic devices, they will also fall into 2A or 2B, and this is where it becomes complicated because you have to have a notified body. It's a medium risk product, so a notified body would be needed to look at the quality system. Rule 10 is for diagnosis. So I have seen some devices where you put your fingers over the camera and it actually makes a diagnosis. And generally they're in Class 2A or potentially Class 2B, so again you would need a notified body to come in and assess how it's actually manufactured and designed. The majority of apps are going to fall into Class 1. Things like dose calculators, they'll fall into Class 1. And also it's been pointed out to us that there may be some apps in future, I don't know if there are any apps around, maybe some of you might know, in terms of actually contraception, you might have to feed in a load of different data in terms of when the period, woman's period was, their temperatures, that sort of thing. There could be a device, an app that works out when, if you have sex at a certain time of the month, then you're unlikely to actually conceive. So finally, also, which is absolutely critical, post-market surveillance. So once the device is actually on the market, you need to monitor the performance of the device, and any problems which come up may need to actually be identified and reported to the competent authorities. And this is known as the medical device vigilance system, and this is absolutely key. This is how we monitor the market. So if any of you know of any apps, medical apps, which fall into the definition of a medical device that aren't performing, then at the MHRA we'd like to know about them. Because obviously we're concerned if there are apps out there which aren't performing as they should be, they're not regulated as medical devices, we would like to take action against them and take them off the market. So it's absolutely critical, if you come across any apps which you think are unsuitable for use, that we're actually informed of those. So thanks for your time. I'll be here till lunchtime, so if you've got any specific questions now or over lunch, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
morning. It's an area that we think the NHS is really struggling with at the moment in terms of some of the healthcare app development. Has anyone got any sort of questions? I've got a couple from other parties online, but anyone got any burning questions for Rob?
One question. By the very nature of app stores such as iTunes and
Yeah.
Google Play Store or whatever, what is the issue about jurisdiction in terms of the country of origin of the product or the software
Yeah.
application?
Basically, if they're on the internet, then we would take any jurisdiction anywhere around the world would take action.
Right.
So it could be available on the App Store in America, but probably we would work with the FDA in America to say these apps are unsuitable, take them off. Get Apple to take them off of their system. So the biggest problem we've got is in the Far East, because there's not so much communication with regard to the major regulators around the world, like Australia, Japan, America, Canada, South America. We've got quite close links, and so if we come across apps that are provided in those countries, it's not so much of an issue. In Europe, it's fine, but it's those which say come from China, or although we are working a lot closer with countries like China now, so eventually, hopefully, the loophole will be closed.
Thank you. So just following on from that, Rob, the MHRA issued a bulletin a few years ago now, which was issued to NHS organisations around the use of software in the context of sort of research. I don't think you sort of mentioned that there. Is that going to be part of what's coming out sort of shortly? Is that part of the refresh?
Not really. I think our main focus is we haven't really had that many questions on that in that area. It's mainly been on apps. So we haven't had. I mean, software used in research. If it's pure research, then we probably wouldn't regulate that as a medical device. Most of the inquiries we're getting, and I said that it's exponential. We're getting, whereas we were getting one a month, say 1 or 2 years ago, now we're getting 2 or 3 a day almost. So it's absolutely, questions have risen exponentially. So we're desperate to get the Skypes out, but in terms of research software, we wouldn't, if it's not clinical investigation, it's just used for research, we wouldn't normally regulate those products.
So picking up on the previous sort of comment there, one of the things that we've seen, a lot of the App Store, Google Play Store, there's a lot of what we perceive as medical device apps there, but they've got this caveat for research only. And I think clearly people are trying to, quite happily for people to either buy or to download, but on the basis it's for research only. Whether or not people are using them for non-research, we don't know, but presumably that's something that you can investigate if you feel there's a need.
Feel it's necessary. We probably wouldn't. Resources is very limited. At this day and age, in any part of government, resources is very limited. So basically, what we would do is we'd apply risk to it, and there is a risk with it, but it's difficult to us unless we've got a complaint about these products. We probably wouldn't take any action. We just don't have the resources to proactively investigate these sort of things.
And do you think the App Store vendors are sort of taking a more proactive?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we have
Respect
liaison
themselves.
with the App Store vendors. We're in liaison and discussions with the App Store vendors about apps. Yeah.
So I don't know whether anyone else has picked up on any of the sort of blogs that have been out on this, but there's a lot of sort of chatter at the moment, many blog sites of people saying about how difficult it is trying to get the healthcare apps through particularly Apple. Apple have taken a much stringent approach to the application sort of process. I actually spoke with some Apple representatives at Expo a couple of weeks ago, and they denied that was happening. They said, no, our terms and conditions are set, they're fairly straightforward. We haven't changed our position. Ultimately, as Apple, we're not there to check whether healthcare apps are clinically safe or not, but that's the official view
It
anyway.
is a concern of ours, but unfortunately, as I said, there's much higher risk devices, and if we were to regulate them as closely as medicines, we would need far more staff. And we have to base our investigations on the risk. And proactively, apps haven't taken a high priority at the moment. I mean, it's quite, from our perspective, it's all quite new. It's all quite new to us actually. As I said, a year ago we were getting one inquiry a month maybe, and just in the last few months it's just got, it's taking up a lot of time.
Yeah, we've probably contributed to that, so I apologise. I apologise. Right, a couple of quick questions. I really don't want to put you on the spot, but could we briefly explore a couple of hypotheticals?
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a colleague down in Plymouth University.
Yeah.
The colleague concerned is developing an app at the moment. It's a diabetes app for use in the community. The patient will take that app and then essentially record their blood glucose level into that app.
Yeah.
Now, based on what I understand from your presentation, if all the patient is doing is recording the app and then communicating that to maybe a diabetes specialist,
Yeah.
it's not a medical device.
No.
But presumably, if that same app is then taking the information when it's logged in and saying perhaps, ooh, it's too high, too low,
Yeah.
you need to do this with your insulin levels at a particular time, then it would become a medical device.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it's actually advising the patient on the treatment.
Yeah.
So they're using that information.
Yeah.
That changes the trick. They wouldn't do that unless they were told
Yeah.
to do that by the app. So that comes down to the question that we always use at MHRA is the output from the app affecting patient treatment? If the output from the app is affecting patient treatment, then it would be a medical device. So in that particular case, it would be a medical device.
Okay. And then the final one, not to
Yeah.
keep you on the spot for too long, let's delve into the grey area very, very quickly. Okay. We've got hypothetical clinical decision support app. Highly complex. Great for this hypothetical clinician who puts in certain parameters. Maybe it's being fed with other physiological parameters. The upshot of it is that clinical decision support tool will actually give an informed view on the health status of that particular patient. Okay. Now, it's got a smart algorithm, algorithms behind it. So at that level, you'd say it's potentially informing the clinical decision. It's giving derived information to the clinician on which to base an intervention or not. However, this same app allows the individual, in this case the clinician, to actually see the raw physiological data, lab data, etc. Now, from what I saw there, in this grey area, if the clinician can actually see the raw data on the app as well as the derived data, on the basis of seeing the raw data, it may not be a medical device.
I would say it probably isn't in that case, because he's got the raw data to look at, and he's got the proposed indication from the output from the app, but he can then say, yes, he can look at the raw data and say, yes, that seems a reasonable output from that app, and therefore I will make that decision.
Difficult one, because they might have to go delving into
Yeah.
the app to actually find that raw data, whereas presumably, in my hypothetical, it's presented
I think if he's
derived
got
data in
both,
a very
then
simple way. But
he would, I would think as a clinician, in a professional way, he would look at the raw data and say, yes, what's coming out of the app seems to make sense, and I fully support what's coming out of it. Based on the raw data, he may make a different clinical decision.
If I can just add, I mean, there are lots of grey areas here. It's very difficult to get lots of questions on this. There is no case law. I would suggest if you do something that might be perceived as a cynical attempt to get around the regulations, for example, saying it's for research only when it's obvious from your marketing strategy you're intending it to be used for real, or saying because you can actually see 200 megabytes of raw data, it's your responsibility to take the clinical view, when actually your intention is to do that for the clinician, that might not be successful.
Yeah, I mean, if it's as much as 200 megabytes.
So I would think very much about your intentionality. If your intentionality is genuine research, I think you're safe, and somebody happens to use it for live treatment, if it's reasonable to expect somebody to review the data and say, does this dosage calculation look sensible, then you might be okay. But I think we're in
If you're talking about 200 megabytes of data,
Yeah, or even a couple of pages
there's
worth.
no-
It's like, it's like the legal applicability of terms and conditions that you can't reasonably expect to read. And until we get some case law on this, we're not going to get an answer. There's very little case law, I think.
No, that's right. And actually it's an interesting point because in terms of this grey area, the NHS is going to have to tread very carefully because I can't see many NHS organisations wanting to take a chance in the grey area. They're not in a position really where most of them can do that. Media will quite happily sort of play up some of the issues anyway. Okay, leave it there unless there's any further questions.
One more
Sorry.
question. You mentioned about notified bodies,
Yeah.
being external commercial organisations. How much do they charge for that service, for that development?
For a small company, they'll probably charge about £2,000 for an assessment, and that's probably an annual fee of about £2,000, well maybe £3,000 to start with, and then probably £1,500 a year. If it's a small, if you're just talking about one piece of software, it's not that it costs far more to develop the software than it does for the bodies to come and look at it.
Presumably the higher the class, the more.
Oh, in a higher class for, say, if you're talking about, say, a breast implant or a cardiovascular implant, you're talking, well, it's going to cost a company millions to develop it, and then a notified body is going to charge tens of thousands of pounds to review the data. But for something like, for a medium class 2A, 2B software, it's going to cost more for the manufacturer to put in the quality, because they're going to have a quality system in place in terms of how the product's designed, manufactured and tested. So it's going to cost more money, a lot more money to do that than to actually pay for the notified body. So you're talking, yeah, for an initial assessment, you're probably talking about £3,000, then an ongoing annual survey, which you're talking about probably £1,500 a year. For a small, if you're a large company making lots of different types of software, then obviously it's a lot more expensive. But if you're just a small start SME, for example, then that's the sort of level of fees you're talking about.
Makes the whole app sustainability question even more significant, doesn't it? In that context,
Yeah,
there's
because you
additional
said
costs.
earlier, you can knock something out on a wet weekend and it'll work, but then if you've got to pay for £3,000 if you're from this idea, then
I think the majority of apps are going to be class 1.
Mm.
I think in the lowest risk, they're not going to need any intervention. So
Yeah.
it's not like a dose calculator. I know it's high, although when you think about it, it's fairly high risk. It's just when the regulations were developed back in the mid-1990s, nobody even thought of nobody even heard of apps that long ago. So basically, there's no real provision in there for these types of products at the moment. So they just weren't thought of at the time. So I mean, a dose calculator probably is a high risk product, but it just falls within, in terms of the classification rules, it falls into the risk category.
Thank you, Rob, for your time.